Erev Tov, everyone. I mentioned to you yesterday that Yisro, according to the Midrash, has 7 different names. Yisro, Yeser, Chovov, Reuel, Keni. There's 7 different names. Chazal also say that Moshe Rabbeinu has 7 different names. Aside from Moshe, which, by the way, the Even Ezra says is an Egyptian name. And he says that the verb kimin amayim mishisihu is an Egyptian verb that came into Hebrew. It's not originally a Hebrew verb. But Moshe has 7 names. Yekusiel, Tovia, Tuvia, Yered, 7 different names. So what does it mean that a person has different names? And we find throughout Tanakh that people have different names. We just completed the book of Ruth earlier this week. And the Gemara says that the real name of Boaz isn't Boaz, he is Ivtzan, who is mentioned as being one of the Shoftim. In fact, the last Shofet before Shmuel Hanavi. And we find other places in Tanakh. Shlomo HaMelech, Shlomo is not his name. Itiel is his name. So what's going on? And we find that names, the Torah itself considers names very important. The names of the Ovos, the Imos. So that, your name will not be Avrom anymore, it'll be Avraham. Sarai won't be Sarai, she'll be Sarah. Yitzchak, Kol HaShomeya Yitzchak li. Yaakov, Yodo Ochezes Be'akev Esav Ochiv. Esav, because he is formed completely. So names are not, so to speak, items to be toyed with. And so what does it mean that Yisro had 7 names or Moshe had 7 names? Or that the names in Tanakh are not really their names? The Meforshim deal with this in a number of different ways. One way to look at it is we are different people at different stages of our lifetime. In the Gemara in Sukkah says that at the Simchas Beis HaShoeva, the Skanim would dance and they would say, Ashrei Ziknaseinu Shechiper Al Yaldoseinu. We are fortunate that in our old age, we have been able to rectify, so to speak, what we did when we were young. We all know that youth many times indulges in things that are wrong. That's why all the bulk of the advertising industry is addressed towards the younger generation. If you're past 35, I don't know if that applies to anybody here, but if you're past 35, so they're not interested in you anymore. It's not their demographic target group. So when someone has 7 names, Chazal saw that as a progression. At times he was Yisro, at times he advanced to become Yeser, more. Then he advanced to become Chovav, beloved. He's beloved and he loves others. He's the whole story with Moshe Rabbeinu and his daughters is that he said, invite him in. We'll give him to eat. We'll see what, Ruel, he's a friend of God. So there are different stages that people go through. And at every stage, so to speak, their names change. Their identities change. This past week, the great Uri Zohar, Zichrono Livrocha, passed away. So the Israeli media, both on the internet and on the radio, which is my only connection to it, but they don't know what to do with him. How do you deal with it? Which Uri Zohar are we talking about? So they show clips from his movies and from his earlier life and from all of the wild things that he did. And he's a great talent. He's hilarious. And then they show him in the full regalia, the unkempt beard, the big black hat, and the capote. Who's that? How did that happen? So I saw an interview with Arik Einstein, who's one of the great Israeli entertainers, and who's the father-in-law of Uri Zohar. Uri Zohar married they became Baalei, his family became Baalei Tshuva, everybody except him. And the interviewer who was, the Israeli interviewers are not polite, put it mildly. Tried to get to him. And he kept on saying, I don't understand them either. I knew him through all this. I don't know. So then he should have a different name. Because the second Uri Zohar doesn't fit the first Uri Zohar. It's two different people, even though it's the same person. And that's what Chazal meant when they said that the Shinui Hashem makes for a different person. We resort to it if, God forbid, someone is ill. So then we change the person's name. We add a name, change the name. And in effect, we say the Gzeira of illness was pronounced upon so-and-so. But it's not pronounced upon, and then they say the new name because that name just came into being. Well, there's a Shinui Hashem also in spiritual matters. And therefore, we find in Tanakh that David HaMelech had different names. When he became king, so then they called him David. Before then, they only called him Ben Yishai. He had no name. And Shlomo HaMelech, until he became king, so he was Ethiel. When he became king, it's Shlomo. Misha Shalom Shalom. Because Shlomo HaMelech, his 40-year reign was free of war. The only reign of a king amongst the Jewish people that was completely peaceful. So the idea of the name characterizes much more than just the physical identity of the person. And we find that in the nations of the world too. If somebody becomes the king, he takes a different name. I think George VI of England, the father of Queen Elizabeth, so originally his name was David. Albert, whatever. He had a lot of names. But they changed the name. And Lahabdul Elef Avdolas by the Goyim, when a guy becomes the Pope, it's a completely different name. Because this is a concept that Judaism gave to the world. That when you're a commoner, so to speak, okay, this is your name, that's who you are. But now if you're the king, you're somebody else, so we have to call you by a different name. So we see that in the Torah. We see that by Yisro, that he's called by different names because he himself has different progressions in life. So Yisro is Kohen Midyon. But Chovov, when we meet him now by the desert after Matan Torah, so that's not his name anymore. His name is Chovov. When he comes into Eretz Yisrael, they'll be called Kani, my nest where I live. And therefore, that is a great lesson. That's a great lesson as to what names represent for us. It's part of the tradition of the Ashkenazim. The Sephardim also have a tradition to name children after previous antecedents in the family. that the Sephardim do it as a term of honor to living fathers or grandfathers. The Ashkenazim do it to deceased. So what's involved in that? So again, Kabbalistically, what we're trying to do is infuse into the soul of the newborn child, into the psyche of the newborn child, the tradition of what went on before him. So he's called on the name of his grandfather or great-grandfather, or on the name of a great scholar or a holy man. So that's an attempt to somehow shape the life of the infant from the moment of birth, so to speak, 8 days later, or with a woman even earlier, to shape it in such a way that it's the child is not in a vacuum. He comes from somewhere. And we see that throughout Jewish history. Chazal say that when the Jews were in Mitzrayim, they didn't change their clothing and they didn't change their names. It doesn't say that they were Kaya mitzvahs. It doesn't say that they were honest people. It doesn't say that somehow slavery did not affect their morals. So what preserved them? So the rabbis say because they didn't change their clothing, they were identifiable as Jews. You can see what a Jew looks like. So I heard that one of the things that Arik Einstein said was they asked him what impressed him most about Uri Zohar after he became a Baal Tshuva. So he said they went together, I don't know what exactly where, it's in a very big airport, and that they were like the only Jews in the airport. I think it was in Asia somewhere. And Zohar put on talis and film in the airport in front of everybody. He said that's what impressed him most. Because everybody else, he said, would have a feeling of busha. So they didn't change their clothing and they didn't change their names. Apparently that was enough to keep them. So that eventually when Moshe came and said, we're going to leave, the large percentage of the people heard it. Struck a responsive chord because they had some feeling of uniqueness. And that's why names are so important. And throughout Jewish history, so we have a lot of names that came from the outside. There's no question about it. All the names that come from the outside, the Jews Judaized. They somehow put it into a Jewish context. So it became a Jewish name, especially the Yiddish names. But even in the Sephardic world, there are many names that are from simply the Arabic or the Middle Eastern culture. But the emotion that lies behind the name, that's what fuels the uniqueness of the Jew. And therefore, that's why Chazal were so interested that Yisro had 7 names, Moshe had 7 names, people in Tanakh have different names. in order to point out to us that sometimes the name defines the person and defines the period of that person's life and is therefore meant to be a connection to tradition and to eternity. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash Omer HaKadosh Baruch Hu L'Zakos Yisrael Lefichach Yirbo Lahem Torah Mitzvot Shenemar Adonai Chafetz Man Sitro Yagil Torah V'Yadir.